There is a moment in every career when the thing you feared most stops being a possibility and becomes a fact. For Diana Caldwell, that moment arrived on a Tuesday morning in October in a muddy field along the Cedar River in Bremer County, Iowa, when she watched the exhaust stack of a Vermeer D220X horizontal directional drill disappear beneath the surface of the earth. No explosion, no warning siren, no dramatic collapse. Just a slow, quiet vanishing like the ground had simply decided it was done with the machine and pulled it under. Diana stood at the edge of the hole and said nothing for a long time. Around her, men were shouting into radios, running toward equipment, calling supervisors in Des Moines. The whole site had erupted into the particular chaos that follows the moment when something enormous and expensive goes catastrophically wrong. But Diana stood still. She stood still because she had known this was coming. She had known for 3 months. She had the paperwork to prove it. That was the worst part. Not the machine in the ground, not the delay, not the insurance call she would have to make before noon. The worst part was the folder sitting in her truck, the one with her name on it, and a formal objection stamp from August 14th, the one that said in the careful, precise language of a woman who had spent 22 years learning how to be taken seriously in a room full of men, "This Tuyen carries significant geological risk, and I recommend an alternate route." The worst part was being right. Diana Caldwell had grown up 40 miles from this field on a farm outside of Waterloo that her father had worked for 30 years before his knees gave out. She had learned to read soil before she learned to read maps. She had known the way farm children always know that Iowa land is not uniform, that beneath the flat surface of these fields ran invisible rivers of old geology, pockets of glacial material left behind by ice sheets that retreated 10,000 years ago, material that behaved like solid ground until it didn't, until something heavy sat on it, until the pressure was wrong and the water table was high, and a $2.2 million drill was boring through solid clay directly above a pocket of prehistoric muck that no survey had caught because the surveys had been done in July when the water table was low and everything looked fine. She had flagged it in August, in writing, with her signature on it. The response had come back in 9 days. The alternate route would cost an additional $400,000 and add 6 weeks to the timeline. The project was already behind. The decision had been made at a level above hers by people in offices in Des Moines who had looked at the numbers and seen a cautious project manager who was probably being overcautious the way cautious people sometimes are. The formal objection had been noted and filed. The project had proceeded on the original route, and now the machine was in the ground. Diana did not say any of this to the men running around her. She did not pull out the folder or hold up the August 14th memo, or say a single word about having told anyone so. She had been in this industry long enough to know that the moment a woman says, "I told you so," she becomes the problem, even when she is also the solution. So she put the folder in the back of her mind, in the place where she kept all the things she was right about that nobody had wanted to hear, and she turned her attention to the hole. The hole was the problem now. The machine was the problem now. That was the only thing that mattered. Her name was Diana Caldwell, and she was 48 years old, and she had managed projects in 11 states, and she had never, not once in 22 years, lost a piece of equipment to the ground. She pulled out her phone and started making calls. To understand what happened that morning, you need to understand the machine and the ground that swallowed it. The Vermeer 220X is not just a piece of construction equipment. It is the kind of machine that makes other machines look simple. 60 tons of steel and hydraulics and computer-controlled precision capable of boring a tunnel 200 feet underground and emerging on the other side within half an inch of its target coordinates. It can drill through solid rock. It can navigate around buried utilities using GPS guidance that updates in real time. It costs more than most people's houses and runs on software that fills 3 server racks back at the manufacturer's facility in Pella, Iowa. It cannot float. Jake Harwell had been operating horizontal directional drills for 17 years. He had worked in every kind of ground: limestone, sandstone, river, clay, decomposed granite. He had drilled under highways and rivers and railroad tracks, and once memorably under a runway at a regional airport in Nebraska while planes were landing overhead. He was not a man who startled easily. What he felt that morning startled him. He would describe it later to Diana and then to the insurance investigators and then to the company engineers who flew in from Des Moines as the sensation of driving onto ice. One moment the machine was sitting on solid clay, the tracks gripping exactly as they should, the drill doing its job 40 feet below the surface of the Cedar River. The next moment, something changed beneath him. Not a collapse, not a sudden drop. Something more gradual and more frightening than that. A softening. The ground beneath the machine's tracks went from firm to yielding in the span of about 4 seconds. Jake did what his training told him to do. He pulled back on the throttle. He hit the reverse control. He felt the tracks spin. What he did not know, what no one on the surface knew yet, was that the drill had broken through the lower boundary of a hard clay deposit into a lens of glacial, till a pocket of saturated material deposited by the last glacier to cross northern Iowa around 12,000 years ago. The stuff was extraordinary in the worst possible way. It was not quite liquid and not quite solid. It was something in between, a suspension of ancient silt and clay and water that behaved like quicksand when disturbed, flowing around heavy objects, filling gaps, creating suction that multiplied with depth. The machine was sinking, and then the computer did what it was designed to do. The Vermeer D220X is equipped with a traction control system that monitors wheel slip and automatically reduces engine power when the tracks lose grip. The engineers who designed this system were solving a real problem. On a normal job site, runaway wheel spin can damage the undercarriage, overheat the engine, burn through hydraulic fluid. The safety system was built to protect a very expensive machine from a very common problem. The problem was that this was not a normal situation. When the computer detected the track slip, it cut engine power by 40%. At the moment when Jake needed maximum force to reverse the machine up out of the softening ground, the machine's own brain decided that maximum force was dangerous and dialed it back. The tracks kept spinning, but slower now, reduced RPM. Not enough grip to pull 60 tons of metal backward against the suction that was already building around the undercarriage. Jake tried overriding the system. The override required a key sequence that took 11 seconds to enter. He got through 6 of them before the machine tilted and he had to grab the roll bar. By the time the backup crew reached the site, the machine was down to its cab. By the end of the first hour, only the exhaust stack was visible. By noon, that was gone too. Diana stood at the edge of the hole and looked at 60 tons of the most advanced boring technology in the world, buried 12 feet below the surface of a field in Iowa, and began calculating how bad this was going to get. The answer was very bad. The machine itself was insured, but the recovery costs were not fully covered. The project was already 11 days behind schedule. 14 rural communities along the Waverly-Tripoli corridor were waiting for high-speed internet service that had been promised to them for 2 years. The fiber optic cable that the drill had been pulling through the ground before it sank was still threaded through the tunnel, still potentially intact but unreachable until the machine could be recovered. And the machine was not coming up on its own. The first recovery attempt took place on the afternoon of the same day. Diana had authorized the deployment of 2 Caterpillar D8 bulldozers, the largest track-type tractors on the project site. Each one weighed around 40 tons and produced just under 300 horsepower. Chained together in tandem, they represented 600 combined horsepower of pulling force, more than enough, according to the calculations that Preston Webb had done on his laptop in the site trailer, to break the suction and drag the drill sideways out of the hole. Preston Webb was 27 years old and had a mechanical engineering degree from Purdue, in the particular confidence of a young man who has spent his entire career being the smartest person in most rooms he has entered. He was not arrogant in an aggressive way. He was arrogant in the quiet, institutional way of someone who has been told consistently and repeatedly by universities and employers and professional assessments that his way of understanding the world is the correct one. He had run the numbers. The numbers said it should work. The numbers were wrong. Diana watched from 20 feet back as the dozer crews set up the chain configuration. The chains were rigged to the drill's exposed frame, running back and up to both bulldozers parked on what looked like solid ground. The crews checked the connections. The operators got their signals. The engines roared. For about 4 seconds, it looked like it might work. The chains went taut. The bulldozer's engines dropped into a lower register, the exhaust stacks blowing black, the whole machine shuddering with the effort. Then the tracks began to spin. Not slipping a little, not losing partial traction. Just spinning freely. the steel cleats throwing divots of Iowa topsoil backward, while the dozers themselves began to crab sideways, pushed back by the resistance they couldn't overcome. The drill did not move. Diana signaled the operators to stand down before they tore up any more ground. She walked back to the site trailer without a word. Preston was already recalculating. The second attempt came the following morning. A recovery specialist from Des Moines arrived with a winch truck, a vehicle Diana had used twice before on difficult extractions. The winch rated at 100 tons of pulling force. The operator, a compact, matter-of-fact man named Roy, set 4 concrete dead men 8 feet into the ground and anchored the truck to them before applying any load. He explained the setup to Diana with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times in many places. He did not mention that he had never worked in glacial till before. When Roy engaged the winch, the cable drew tight over the drill's buried frame, and for a moment the whole system held. The dead men held. The anchors held. The cable stretched under the load with the faint metallic hum of steel under stress. Then one of the dead men let go. The concrete block, 8 inches square and 4 feet long, came out of the ground like a champagne cork and traveled approximately 40 feet in a low arc before landing in the mud 6 inches from where one of the ground crew was standing. The man did not move. He was too surprised to move. The concrete block hit the ground and bounced once and stopped. Nobody was hurt. That was the only good thing about that moment. Diana walked over to where the ground crew member was standing, still staring at the concrete block. She put her hand on his shoulder and asked if he was all right. He said yes. She believed him. She looked at the block sitting in the mud, then at the hole it had come from, then at Roy, who was looking at the winch cable with the expression of a man mentally drafting an incident report. She signed the order to stand down all recovery operations using that equipment class. If anyone had been standing 12 inches to the right, she would have been making a very different phone call. The third attempt was never really an attempt at all. The crane arrived early on the third morning, a Liebherr LTM with 90 tons of rated lifting capacity, the largest mobile unit available within 200 miles. The operator, whose name was Gerald, and who had been running cranes since before Diana had graduated high school, got out of the cab and walked the perimeter of the site for 25 minutes without speaking. He looked at the ground. He looked at the hole. He looked at the position of the buried machine relative to the nearest stable ground. He performed calculations that he did not share with anyone. Then he walked back to where Diana was waiting and told her what she already suspected. He said that the ground conditions around the hole were not stable enough to support his outrigger pads under a real load. He said that the suction on the buried machine, given its depth and the material it was in, would likely create a dynamic load spike at the moment of lift that his rated capacity could not absorb safely. He said that if he set up and engaged the lift and the ground shifted, he would be going in next to the drill, and a 90-ton crane in a glacial till pocket was a problem that nobody wanted. He said all of this quietly and without apology, the way experienced people state facts. Diana thanked him for his assessment. She meant it. There is a particular kind of courage in being the person who is capable of solving a problem and choosing on the basis of honest evaluation not to try. Gerald had saved himself, his crew, and very possibly Diana's crew, from a second catastrophic equipment loss. The fact that it left her with nothing was not his fault. She stood at the edge of the hole on the morning of the third day and looked at what 3 days of the best available modern recovery equipment had produced. A lot of churned up ground, 2 close calls, and a drill that was now 12 feet deep and dropping another few inches per day as the glacial till continued its patient, indifferent work. The insurance company had sent an adjuster. The adjuster had used the word dig out 3 times in their last conversation. A dig out was the option of last resort, excavating the surrounding ground by hand and machine until the drill could be lifted free. The estimate for a full dig out in these conditions was $8 million and 4 months. The project could not absorb 4 months. Diana was standing at the edge of the hole with her phone in her hand, composing a message to the regional director that she had started and deleted 4 times when the truck pulled in. It was an old Ford, the kind of truck that has lived its entire life doing actual work and shows every day of it. The paint was a color that might have once been blue. The side panels carried the layered history of a working vehicle, mud oil, a dent above the rear wheel well that had never been fixed because fixing it would not have helped the truck do its job. It parked at the edge of the sight boundary with the quiet confidence of a vehicle driven by someone who is exactly where he intends to be. The man who got out was 81 years old. Diana registered him the way she registered most things quickly, completely, with the particular attentiveness of someone who has learned that detail matters. Worn overalls, not dirty in the careless way, but worn in the way of clothing that has been washed hundreds of times. A canvas cap faded to a color somewhere between green and gray. Hands that told the whole story, large, deliberate, the hands of a man who has spent 6 decades moving things that need moving. He walked with the careful economy of someone who has learned to be precise about where he puts his weight. Not slow, deliberate. There is a difference. The site security guard moved to intercept him. Diana started to raise her hand to confirm the intercept. Then she stopped, because the old man had walked to the edge of the hole and he was looking into it, and he was looking at it the way she had looked at it, not with the shock of someone encountering the problem for the first time, but with the quiet focus of someone already thinking about the solution. She let him look. She waited. He stood at the edge of the hole for a long time. He looked at the ground around the perimeter. He looked at the angle of the equipment that had failed. He looked at the distance between the stable ground and the edge of the excavation. He looked at the mud line and did something with his lips that might have been arithmetic. Then he turned and walked toward Diana. She was the senior person on site. He had identified that correctly without anyone telling him. That was worth noticing. "That's your machine in the ground," he said. "Yes," Diana said. "And this is a closed site. I'm going to need to ask you, what have you tried?" She looked at him. In a different state of mind, she might have dismissed the question, redirected him to the security guard, moved on to the message she needed to finish composing. But she was on day 3 of a recovery effort that had nearly killed one of her crew members and was currently pointing toward a 4-month dig-out and the worst project outcome of her career, and there was something in the directness of the question that she could not quite dismiss. "Everything," she said. "Bulldozers, winch, truck, crane. Nothing works. The mud has suction, and the ground won't hold equipment close enough to do any good." He nodded, not sympathetically, practically, the nod of someone filing information. "How deep to the cab?" "About 12 feet, 14 to the tracks. Weight, 60 tons roughly." He looked back at the hole, then at the ground, then at the line of failed recovery equipment parked along the site edge. "I can pull that out," he said. Preston Webb had been listening from 10 feet away. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Sir," Diana said, "we've had 2 Cat D 8's 100-ton winch truck and a 90-ton crane out here. None of them could move it. What are you thinking about using my Cat 75 diesel one?" he said. 1935 model." There was a silence. Preston said, "A 1935 Caterpillar. That's what 70 horsepower, ma'am." He looked at Diana. "Our dozers were putting out 300 each. 600 combined. They couldn't do it. 70 horsepower isn't going to." "Your dozers are built to push," the old man said. His voice was patient, not the patience of someone being tolerant, the patience of someone who has had this exact conversation before and knows exactly where it goes. They're geared for speed. When the load doesn't move, the tracks spin. That's physics, not failure. You were never going to pull it out that way. Preston started to respond with something about torque curves and gear ratios. Diana held up her hand, not to silence Preston, though it had that effect. She held it up because she was thinking. She was thinking about her father, who had farmed outside of Waterloo for 30 years, who had taught her to read the kind of information that does not appear on any survey document. She was thinking about the way some people look at a problem and see numbers, and the way other people look at a problem and see the problem. She was thinking about the fact that this man who had parked an old Ford at the edge of her site and walked straight to the edge of the hole without anyone directing him was looking at this situation the way a person looks at something they understand. "What's your name?" she said. "Earl Whitmore," he said. "My farm's about 4 miles north. My grandson works construction. He told me what happened." "Earl," she said, "if your machine can do this, tell me why." It was not an invitation to convince her. It was a test. There's a difference. Earl Whitmore looked at her for a moment, and in that moment something shifted between them. A small recalibration, the recognition of one person by another. He had been expecting to have to argue. He could see that she was not going to make him argue. He respected that. Suction mud doesn't release to sudden force, he said. You pull hard and fast, the mud grips harder. You have to pull slow and steady, give the mud time to release, let air and water get into the gap. You need a machine that makes the same force at 1 mile per hour that it makes at 5. Something that won't quit when the load doesn't move right away. He paused. Your modern equipment gives up, he said. While the operators, the machines, they're built with systems that cut power when traction drops. They protect themselves. My Caterpillar doesn't have those systems. It doesn't know it should stop, so it doesn't. Diana looked at him for a long moment. She was 48 years old and she had managed $200 million worth of infrastructure projects across 11 states. She had worked with engineers who had PhDs and operators who had 30 years in the field and consultants who charged more per hour than some of her crew made per day. She had developed over those 22 years a very precise sense of the difference between people who understood what they were talking about and people who thought they did. Earl Whitmore understood what he was talking about. She also knew something else. She knew that the 3-month dig-out estimate was going to be finalized in the next 48 hours. She knew that once it was finalized, it would become the plan, and once it became the plan, it would be very difficult to stop. And 4 months from now in January in Iowa, digging out a buried drill rig in Glacial, till in winter conditions was going to be a different and worse problem than the one she was facing today. She knew that the insurance company adjuster was already writing language that was going to be very difficult to reverse. She knew that she was standing at the edge of a decision that nobody else on this site was positioned to make. That was what 22 years in a formal objection in a folder in her truck had bought her. The right to make the call. All right, she said, get your tractor. Let's see what it can do. Earl nodded once, already turning back toward his truck. Earl, she said. He stopped. If this worked, she said, what do you want for it? He considered the question with the same deliberateness he had brought to everything else. My grandson told me you've got a deadline, he said. Pipeline won't build itself. And that was all he said. He walked back to his truck and got in and drove off the site to go get a machine that had been running since 1935. Diana turned back to the hole. Around her, the site had gone quiet in the way sites go quiet when something has shifted, but nobody is quite sure yet what it has shifted to. Preston Webb was looking at her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a young man who has been educated into certainty and is encountering for the first time the possibility that certainty has limits. You're serious, he said. I'm always serious, Diana said. Go find out what we have for chain on this site, heavy chain, not cable, and call someone who knows what a snatch block is. She pulled out her phone and started a new message, not the one to the regional director, a different one to the project foreman with instructions for clearing the approach path on the north side of the hole. She did not know if this was going to work. She was honest enough with herself to hold that uncertainty clearly. But she had been right in August, and nobody had listened, and she had watched 3 days of the best available modern equipment fail in exactly the ways she had suspected they would fail. And now an 81-year-old farmer with a machine that was older than most of the grandparents of anyone on this site had looked at the problem and described the solution in plain, precise language that she recognized as correct. Diana Caldwell had spent 22 years learning how to be right in a world that didn't always want to hear it. She knew what right sounded like. She went back to work. It took 2 hours to get the Caterpillar from Earl Whitmore's farm to the construction site. The machine could not travel on public roads. It was too slow, too wide, and too heavy for asphalt that was not built to hold it. So Earl called his grandson Cole, who kept a flatbed trailer at the farm for moving equipment, and Cole drove out and they loaded the Caterpillar together, the two of them working without speaking much, because they had done this kind of thing before and did not need to narrate it. The trailer groaned when the machine rolled onto it. 12 tons settling onto steel, the suspension compressing the tires spreading against the gravel of the farm road. But it held. It always held. Cole drove carefully the way you drive when you are carrying something irreplaceable. Diana was standing at the north approach to the site when the trailer came through the gate. She had spent the 2 hours doing what she always did when she was waiting on something she could not control. She worked. She had called Des Moines and told the regional director that she was pursuing an additional recovery option before authorizing the dig-out estimate. She had supervised the clearing of the north approach, moving equipment and cable reels, to open a path wide enough for a large crawler tractor. She had located 3 lengths of heavy logging chain in the equipment storage and had them laid out near the hole. She had found a snatch block in the rigging kit and confirmed it was rated for the load it was going to be asked to handle. She had not told the regional director what the additional recovery option was. Some information is better delivered as results. When the Caterpillar rolled off the trailer, everyone on the site stopped what they were doing. Diana had expected this. She had not expected the particular quality of the silence that followed. It was not the silence of mockery, though she had seen Preston Webb take out his phone and type something probably to a colleague, probably something he thought was funny. It was more the silence of genuine bewilderment. The machine looked like it belonged in a museum. It looked like something from a photograph, the kind of black and white image you find in County Historical Society archives showing men in suspenders standing beside equipment that changed the world before the world moved on to other things. The Caterpillar Diesel 75 was massive in a way that modern equipment is not. Modern construction machinery is designed around efficiency, lightweight alloys, enclosed cabs, computerized controls that minimize operator effort and maximize fuel economy. The 75 had been designed around a different set of priorities. It was iron and steel, dense and deliberate, built in an era when the measure of a machine was how much it could move and for how long without stopping. The tracks were 4 feet wide, wider than the tracks on the D8 bulldozers that had failed 3 days earlier. The body had the squared, purposeful look of something designed by engineers who were solving a specific problem and had no interest in solving anything else. It was covered in 80 years of oil stains and field dust and the particular patina that accumulates on a working machine that has never been restored because restoration would have interrupted the work. The yellow paint that the Caterpillar Company had applied in 1935 existed now only in the recessed areas where weathering couldn't reach. Everything else had gone to bare metal and surface rust, the honest color of a tool that has been used. Earl climbed down from the trailer and started the engine. It caught on the first compression. A sound came out of the exhaust stack that was different from the sounds of the modern equipment on site lower and more deliberate, a diesel rhythm that seemed to come up through the ground as much as through the air. Several of the crew members looked at each other. Diana looked at the exhaust stack and watched the smoke clear, from black to gray to almost nothing within 30 seconds. The engine was running clean. After 85 years of operation, the engine was running clean. Preston Webb had put his phone away. He was watching the machine with an expression Diana could not quite read. "How poem," he said to no one in particular, "is that thing actually running?" Earl was already moving the Caterpillar into position, reading the approach angle with the same quiet attention he had brought to everything else. He did not answer immediately. When he did not look up from what he was doing. "Maintenance," he said. "Oil every 50 hours, grease every day, valve adjustment every 500 hours. Same schedule my father kept. Machine doesn't know how old it is. It just knows if you take care of it." He said it the way people state facts they have never needed to defend because the facts have always defended themselves. Diana filed that sentence away. She did not know yet what she was going to do with it, but she filed it. She watched Earl set up the pull, and she watched it the way she watched everything on a job site with the specific attention of someone responsible for outcomes. But she was watching for something beyond safety and procedure. She was watching for method. She was trying to understand not just what Earl was doing, but why, because she had been in this industry long enough to know that the difference between a technique that works and a technique that fails is usually not the equipment. It is the thinking behind the equipment. The first thing she noticed was the angle. Every previous recovery attempt had been set up with the pulling vehicle well back from the hole. This made intuitive sense. You want your equipment on stable ground away from the edge of an excavation that has already demonstrated its willingness to swallow heavy machinery. The further back you are, the safer you are. The winch truck had been 40 feet from the hole. The bulldozers had been positioned even further. Earl drove the Caterpillar to within 6 feet of the edge. One of the site engineers, a man named Garrett, who had been on the project since day one, took a step forward. "You're going to destabilize the lip," he said. "If the edge goes, edge isn't going anywhere," Earl said without stopping what he was doing. "It's been sitting for 3 days and it hasn't moved. Ground's drained some since it happened. It'll hold." He said it without dismissiveness, just assessment. Then he explained the angle. A long pull, he said, means the cable or chain runs at a low angle from the pulling vehicle down to the buried machine. That angle creates a force vector that has a significant upward component. You are not just pulling the machine horizontally out of the hole, you are also trying to lift it fighting gravity as well as suction. The closer you are, the more horizontal your pull becomes. A horizontal pull slides the machine along the bottom of the hole rather than trying to lift it. In glacial till, with this much suction, sliding is possible. Lifting is not. Garrett listened to this. Diana watched him listen to it. She saw the moment he understood it, the small shift in his expression, when the geometry resolved in his mind, and he recognized that the old man was right. Earl attached the logging chain to the buried drill's frame at a connection point he had identified from the exposed portion of the machine. The chain was massive links as thick as a man's fist, dark with oil and age, the kind of chain that does not break because it was made in an era when chains were expected not to break. His father, Walter, had used this chain to pull stumps on the farm in Bremer County in the 1940s, and it had never been retired because it had never failed. He ran the chain through a snatch block bolted to the Caterpillar's drawbar. Diana knew what a snatch block was. A snatch block is a pulley system. Running the chain through it doubled the mechanical advantage of the pull, meaning the Caterpillar would be exerting twice the force at the buried machine that it was generating at its tracks. It was not a complicated system. It was elegant in the way that simple, correct solutions are elegant not by being clever, but by being exactly right for the problem. Preston was watching this part carefully. Diana could see him working through the math. Earl climbed back onto the Caterpillar's seat and checked his connections one more time from above. Then he looked at Diana. "You might want to stand back some," he said. "When it starts to move, it'll push mud." Diana did not stand back. She moved to a position where she had a clear view of the Caterpillar's tracks and the chain and the mud around the buried machine's frame. She wanted to see everything. Earl put his hand on the throttle and opened it. The Caterpillar's diesel dropped into a lower register. The exhaust stack put up a brief column of black smoke that cleared quickly. The tracks began to move, the steel cleats biting into the Iowa earth with a sound that was different from the sound the bulldozer tracks had made 3 days ago. Less frantic, more deliberate. The chain came off the ground and went taut in stages, link by link, tightening until the whole length was straight and humming with tension. Nothing happened. The buried drill did not move. The Caterpillar's tracks kept turning. Preston opened his mouth. Diana raised one finger without looking at him. He closed it. The tracks were not slipping. That was the thing. That was the detail that Diana had positioned herself to see, and it was the detail that told her everything she needed to know in the first 30 seconds. The D8 bulldozers had lost traction almost immediately, their tracks spinning against the ground, the steel cleats unable to find purchase under the lateral load. It had looked powerful, all that engine noise and exhaust smoke and churning earth, but it had been energy without direction, force without traction. The Caterpillar's tracks were moving at perhaps 2 miles per hour. They were gripping. Every cleat was biting and holding and pulling the machine, inching forward with the patience of something that does not know the concept of giving up, because no one ever built that concept into it. Earl sat on the machine's seat with his hand on the throttle and his eyes moving between the chain and the ground ahead of him and the hole behind him. His expression was the same expression he had worn since he arrived, focused, quiet, completely without drama. He was not straining, he was working. 1 minute passed. The chain was so tight it had begun to vibrate at a frequency Diana could feel in her sternum. The mud around the buried drill's frame had begun to show small fracture lines, hairline cracks radiating outward from the connection point where the chain attached. Something was happening underground that could not be seen, but could be inferred. 2 minutes. Diana was aware that the site had gone completely silent. 30-some people standing in a field in Iowa on a cold October morning, watching an 81-year-old man on an 85-year-old machine do something that 3 days of modern equipment had not been able to do, and nobody was speaking because nobody wanted to be the one who broke whatever was happening. 3 minutes. And then the drill moved. It was not dramatic. It was not the sudden lurch she had half expected, the machine bursting free in a spray of mud, the triumphant moment of release. It was a single half inch of lateral movement, barely perceptible. The kind of movement you might second-guess if you were not looking directly at the reference point she had marked on the frame with a piece of orange flagging tape precisely so she would not second-guess it. But it moved. Diana heard someone behind her say something she could not make out. She did not turn around. Earl had not reacted. He kept the throttle exactly where it was. He had not seen the movement or had seen it and filed it away the same way he filed everything as information, not occasion. Another half inch. Now the mud around the machine was behaving differently. The fracture lines had widened, where the mud had been uniform and undifferentiated. It was now showing movement, a slow, thick circulation, as the sustained lateral force began to disrupt the suction seal that had held the machine for 3 days. Glacial till is not monolithic. It has internal structure planes of lesser resistance, pathways along which force can travel, if applied correctly and for long enough. Earl was finding those pathways, not by analysis, by patience. 5 minutes from when the tracks had first engaged the drill had moved 4 inches. Diana exhaled slowly and did not know she had been holding her breath. The mud released in stages, not all at once. There was a quality to it that reminded her of something her father had described once about pulling fence posts. The ground holds and holds, and then something shifts in the soil structure, and the holding becomes giving almost all at once, the resistance dropping sharply as the suction seal breaks. That moment, her father had said, is what you are waiting for. Not fighting for, waiting for. You cannot force it. You can only maintain the pressure until the ground decides to let go. Earl Whitmore had apparently been taught the same thing by different ground. At the 7-minute mark, the suction broke. It was audible. A deep, wet pulling sound like the earth clearing its throat, and then the mud around the buried drill began to move in earnest, flowing back into the space the machine was vacating, and the drill was sliding, now actually sliding, the horizontal pull working exactly as Earl had said it would work, the machine moving along the bottom of its own excavation toward the surface, rather than being lifted vertically against gravity and suction simultaneously. The cab of the Vermeer broke the surface at the 9-minute mark. Mud poured off it in sheets. The windshield was intact. The roll bar had held. The hydraulic lines that ran along the outside of the frame were still connected. Diana was already doing the damage assessment in her head, cataloging what she could see, estimating what she could not, building the recovery report she would need to file before end of day. Earl stopped the Caterpillar, descended from the seat, walked to the chain connection, and adjusted the angle of pull by 6 inches. Then he climbed back on. Nobody asked why. Everyone watched. The second stage of the pull took another 16 minutes. The drill was tilted at a steep angle, the rear end still buried the front end out and resting against the slope of the excavation. This was the harder part, Diana knew, because now there was still significant suction at the buried end, while the exposed end was creating a different kind of resistance, the machine's own weight working against the pull at an oblique angle. Earl's adjustment of the chain angle had accounted for this, redistributing the force vector to address the new geometry. She did not know if Earl had calculated this mathematically or if he had felt it the way experienced people feel things that they cannot always articulate. She suspected it was both, or that for Earl the distinction between calculating and feeling had collapsed over 6 decades into something that was simply knowing. The rear tracks of the drill emerged from the ground at the 24th minute with a sound that the crew would describe differently depending on who was telling the story. Some said it was like a gasp. Some said it was like a door opening that had been sealed for a long time. Jake Harwell, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd watching the machine he had been operating when it went under, said it sounded like the ground finally saying yes. At 29 minutes, the Vermeer D220X horizontal directional drill, 60 tons of the most advanced boring technology available in 2019, sat on solid Iowa ground. Covered in mud, tilted, one panel dented where the chain had torqued against it, but intact, recoverable, repairable. 3 days of modern equipment had not moved it an inch. An 81-year-old farmer with an 85-year-old machine had pulled it free in under 30 minutes. Nobody said anything for a long time. Then Diana walked over to where Earl was climbing down from the Caterpillar's seat, and she did something she did not do easily. She let someone see that she was moved. Not undone, not overcome, but moved in the specific way of someone who has spent their career surrounded by competence and is encountering unexpectedly something rarer than competence. She shook his hand. His grip was exactly what she would have expected. Firm, unhurried, the handshake of a man who has nothing to prove. I have to ask you something, she said. Earl waited. How did you know it would work? Everyone said it wasn't possible. The engineers, the crane operator, the insurance company, everyone. Earl was quiet for a moment. He looked at the caterpillar, then at the recovered drill, then at the ground between them. When he spoke, he was not answering her question so much as thinking out loud in her direction. My father pulled a hay wagon out of a creek with this machine, he said. 1942. Wagon was in so deep you couldn't see the wheels. Everyone told him to leave it, buy a new one. He said that wagon had to last another 10 years, so leaving it wasn't a choice. He paused. Took him 3 hours. He didn't stop once. Just kept the throttle steady and waited for the mud to let go. He looked at the caterpillar with the expression of a man looking at something he has known so long that looking at it is almost the same as looking inward. This machine doesn't have a computer telling it when to stop, he said. It doesn't have sensors protecting it from working too hard. It just pulls until the job is done. And in 85 years, nothing has ever broken. Diana stood with that for a moment. She was thinking about the folder in her truck. She was thinking about the August 14th memo, the formal objection that Tuyenshi had recommended, and the decision that had overridden her. She was thinking about the fact that the machine was out of the ground and that 4 months of dig-out had been compressed into 29 minutes by a method that no one in a Des Moines office would have approved on paper. She was also thinking about something else, something she had noticed when she was standing with the recovery plan documents that morning, waiting for the trailer to arrive. She had been holding the project map, the one that showed the full Waverly-Tripoli corridor, with the service area outlined in blue, and she had looked at the blue outline, and she had looked at the road running north from the site, and she had followed it with her finger to where Earl Whitmore's farm sat in Bremer County, 4 miles north of where they were standing. Inside the blue outline, the Whitmore farm was inside the service area. It was one of the 14 rural communities that would receive high-speed internet service when the fiber optic cable currently threaded through the tunnel below them was connected and commissioned. Earl Whitmore had driven 4 miles south on a county road to pull up a machine that was carrying the cable that would bring internet to his own land. He had done it without knowing, without asking, without any awareness that the project he had just saved was among other things going to change his own farm. Diana had folded the map and put it in her jacket pocket. She had not said anything about it then, and she did not say anything about it now. It was the kind of irony that felt too complete to speak out loud, the kind of thing that if you said it, it would sound like a story someone had made up. But it was real, and she knew it was real, and she held it quietly the way you hold the things that are too true for words. Earl had already turned back to the caterpillar and was disconnecting the logging chain, coiling it in the precise loops his father had taught him, link over link, the way chains should be stored, so it runs clean next time. Diana looked at the recovered drill, then at the old machine, then at the old man. Preston Webb was standing a few feet away. He had his notebook out. He was writing something, and from the angle, Diana could see it was not notes from a conference call or a project specification. He was drawing the snatch block configuration, the chain angle, the geometry of the pull. He was writing down what he had seen, because what he had seen had not matched what he thought he knew. And Preston Webb, whatever his faults, was honest enough to update what he thought he knew when the evidence required it. That Diana thought was the beginning of something useful. She pulled out her phone and opened the message she had been composing to the regional director. She deleted everything she had written and started again. The new version was longer and more specific and contained no hedge language, no qualifications, no careful distancing from what she was reporting. It described exactly what had happened in the order it had happened, and it named Earl Whitmore by name and described his method and its result. It recommended in language that was direct enough that it could not be misread that Meridian Infrastructure Partners develop a formal protocol for consulting local agricultural knowledge before finalizing recovery strategies for rural project sites. It was the most honest report she had ever written. It was honest in the way that only losing and then winning can make you honest, the way that being right and being ignored and then watching the proof arrive on a flatbed trailer can strip away the careful, self-protective language and leave only what is true. She sent it. Then she walked over to Earl, who had finished coiling the chain and was standing beside the caterpillar with his hands in the pockets of his overalls, looking at the recovered drill the way a doctor looks at a patient who has come through something difficult, not with pride, but with the satisfaction of a problem correctly resolved. "I owe you," Diana said. "You don't," Earl said. "At least let me pay for your fuel." He considered this with the same deliberateness he brought to all things. "Machine burns about 2 gallons an hour," he said. "Call it $10. Diana looked at him for a moment. Then she took out her checkbook and wrote a check for $1,000. Earl looked at the check. He looked at Diana. He held the check out toward her. "That's not what we agreed on," he said. "No," Diana said. "It's not." She did not take the check back. The check sat on the seat of Earl's truck for 4 days. He had taken it back from Diana eventually, not because he had changed his mind about accepting it, but because he did not want to have the argument in front of 30 people on a job site, and the path of least resistance was to fold it once and put it in his shirt pocket and drive the Caterpillar back onto Cole's trailer and go home. He had work to do. The field on the north side of the property needed to be disked before the ground froze, and the tractor's rear hydraulic fitting had been weeping fluid for 2 weeks and needed his attention. He set the check on the truck's bench seat when he got home and did not look at it again that evening. He thought about it some in the way he thought about most things, not with agitation, but with the steady, patient attention he brought to problems that had more than one right answer. Diana Caldwell had written it because she meant something by it, and he understood what she meant. She was not trying to pay him for his time. She was trying to acknowledge something that was difficult to acknowledge in the language that the construction industry ordinarily spoke, which was the language of contracts and liability and itemized invoices. She was trying to say what you did mattered, and I want that mattering to exist somewhere in a form that is real. He understood that. He was not unsympathetic to it. But he had not gone to that job site for money. He had gone because his grandson had told him there was a machine in the ground that nobody could get out, and he had a machine that could get it out. And in Bremer County, in the part of Iowa where Earl Whitmore had been born and farmed and would die, you did not drive past a problem you could solve. That was not a philosophy. It was not even a decision. It was just the way things worked, the same way you did not drive past a neighbor's tractor, broken down on a county road without stopping. The same way you did not let a fence blow down in a storm without fixing it before it became someone else's problem. The world holds together because people do the things that need doing without requiring a transaction around every one of them. The check felt like a transaction. He called Diana on the 5th day. He had gotten her number from Cole, who had gotten it from the project foreman, who had given it without asking why, because everyone on that site had understood by now that Earl Whitmore was not a person you put obstacles between and what he needed. Diana answered on the 2nd ring. "I can't take this," Earl said. A pause. Not surprised. She had probably been waiting for this call. "I know you feel that way," she said, "but I need you to hear something first." He waited. The estimate for digging that machine out by hand was $1.8 million in 4 months, she said. "In winter. In Iowa. I don't need to explain to you what digging in frozen glacial till in January looks like. You saved us from that. You saved the project. You saved 14 communities from another 6 months without broadband service." She paused. $1,000 is not payment. It is barely a gesture. I know you know that. Earl was quiet for a moment. Outside his kitchen window, the north field was doing what it did in late October, going golden gray, the corn stubble catching the low afternoon light. "I don't need gestures," he said. "No," Diana said, "but the Bremer County Historical Society might." Another pause, longer this time. Diana continued, "Their farm equipment preservation program. I looked it up. They've got 3 machines that need restoration work and no funding for it. A 1948 Oliver, a Minneapolis Moline from the 50s, a crawler that might be older than yours. They're sitting in a barn outside of Waverly deteriorating because nobody has the money to stop it." Earl set his coffee cup down on the kitchen table. "You looked that up," he said. "I look things up," she said. "It's how I do my job." He thought about the machine sitting in a barn outside of Waverly, deteriorating. He thought about his father's Caterpillar and what it would have become if no one had maintained it, if no one had bothered. Iron and steel could last a very long time, but only if someone decided they were worth lasting. only if someone showed up every 50 hours with oil and a wrench in the belief that the old things carried something worth keeping. All right, he said. The check was written over to the Bremer County Historical Society before the week was out. Diana added $500 of her own. She did not mention that to Earl. The report she sent to Des Moines produced results she had not entirely anticipated. She had expected the regional director to read it and file it, and perhaps reference it in a future policy memo. That was how these things usually worked. Information moved slowly upward through organizational layers, getting diluted and generalized at each level until it arrived at the top as a vague recommendation that someone might eventually act on. Instead, the regional director forwarded it to the company's operations committee with a cover note that Diana was not supposed to see but did, because the project foreman had a contact in Des Moines who sent it to him, and the foreman sent it to Diana. The cover note described her report as the most useful field documentation the company had received in 5 years. It recommended that the methodology Earl had used be formally studied and incorporated into the company's equipment recovery protocols. 3 months later, Diana was asked to present the Cedar River recovery to the company's annual operations review. She gave the presentation without slides, without bullet points, without the usual architecture of corporate communication. She told it as a story. She told it the way it had happened, in order with the details that mattered: the August memo, the 3 days of failure, the truck and the faded paint, the chain that had belonged to a man who had been dead for 60 years. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when people are actually listening. She did not see the immediate outcome of that presentation in her own career, not right away. But 14 months later, when the regional director retired, Diana Caldwell was offered the position. She took it. She thought about the folder in her truck when she signed the acceptance. She thought about the August 14th memo. She thought about the fact that being right and being heard are not the same thing, and that sometimes the distance between those two conditions is measured in years and in the willingness to keep being right anyway on the record in writing with your name on it. Preston Webb did not send her the paper right away. He sent it 8 months later in June without a cover letter, just an email with an attachment in a subject line that said, "Thought you should have this." She opened the attachment during her lunch break alone in her office. It was 16 pages peer-reviewed, published in the Journal of Construction, Engineering, and Management. The title was Sustained Force Extraction in Cohesive Saturated Soils, a Case Study in Legacy Equipment Application. It was rigorous and precise, and written in the specific language of mechanical engineering, full of load equations and soil behavior models and graphs that translated what Earl Whitmore had done into the formal vocabulary of the discipline. She read the acknowledgments section before she read anything else. She always read the acknowledgments first. She had learned that the acknowledgments told you what the author actually thought underneath the institutional language of the paper itself. Preston had written, "The author wishes to thank Diana Caldwell of Meridian Infrastructure Partners for the opportunity to observe the recovery operation described herein, and Earl Whitmore of Bremer County, Iowa, who demonstrated that patience is a form of engineering that no university currently teaches." Diana read that sentence twice. Then she printed the paper, hole-punched it, and put it in a binder that she placed on her desk beside a photograph she had taken on the morning of October 17, 2019. The Caterpillar sitting on solid ground next to the recovered drill, Earl on the machine seat with his hands still on the throttle, not looking at the camera because he was looking at his work. She had not asked permission to take the photograph. She had simply taken it because she had known standing in that field on that morning that she was looking at something she would need to remember for a long time. Cole Whitmore came home in the spring of 2021. He was 30 years old and he had a steady job with a construction firm in Des Moines, and he drove a truck that was considerably newer than his grandfather's. And by every conventional measure, he had built the kind of life that young men from rural Iowa are supposed to build when they leave rural Iowa. He had built it deliberately and carefully. He was good at his job. He had a future. He drove home on a Sunday in April and told Earl he was coming back to the farm. Earl was in the barn when Cole found him greasing the Caterpillar's track rollers on the same schedule he had kept since before Cole was born. He listened to what Cole said without stopping what he was doing. When Cole finished, Earl set down the grease gun, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and looked at his grandson for a long moment. "You sure?" he said. "Yes," Cole said. That was the end of the conversation about whether. The rest of that year became a conversation about how. Earl taught Cole the way Walter had taught Earl, not from a manual, not from a class, but by doing side by side with the patient repetition of knowledge that cannot be written down because it lives in the hands and the ears and the accumulation of hours spent paying attention to the same machine in all conditions and seasons. He taught Cole the oil schedule and the grease points and the sound the engine made when the valve clearances needed adjusting, which was a particular flatness in the diesel rhythm, a slight roughness that you could hear only if you knew what the right sound was. He taught him other things too, how to read soil by color and texture before you drove heavy equipment across it, how to listen to ground that was about to change which made a different sound under the tracks than ground that was stable, how to look at a slope and know from the way the grass grew which way the water moved underground. These were things that had no formal name. They were the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations of people who had paid close attention to a specific piece of the earth for a very long time, and they were transferable only through presence, through the kind of instruction that requires the instructor and the student to be in the same place doing the same thing repeatedly until the knowledge migrates from one nervous system to another. Earl was 83 years old that summer. He worked every day. He was slower than he had been, more deliberate, more conservative about what he asked of his body, but he was present. He was fully, completely, unhurriedly present in the way that people who have no illusions left about time tend to be present. He knew what he had, and he knew it was finite, and he spent none of it. He told Cole one evening on the porch watching the sun go down over the north field that the world was going to keep building smarter machines. He said that was right. That was progress. But he said that progress was not a replacement for the knowledge of how things worked at the level beneath the software, at the level of iron and leverage in the behavior of soil underload. He said that the computer could tell you there was a problem, but only someone who knew the machine could tell you why. He said that knowing the why was the only thing that made you useful when everything else failed. Cole listened. He was young enough to still be learning and old enough to know it. Earl Whitmore died in December of 2023. He was 85 years old. He died quietly in the farmhouse where he had been born, in the room where his father Walter had died, and where Ruth had died, in a house that had held 4 generations of people who had worked this land and known it and loved it in the specific, unromantic, deeply practical way that farmers love land, which is the way you love something you have staked your life on. Cole found him in the morning. The doctor said he had gone in his sleep, which was the truth and also the mercy. Earl Whitmore had been afraid of very few things in his life, but he had been privately afraid of a long diminishment of the slow losing of capacity that he had watched claim other men his age. He had not gotten that. He had gotten the kind of ending that was in its way as precise and unhurried as everything else about him. The funeral was at the First Lutheran Church in Tripoli. Small, family neighbors, some people from the County Historical Society, a few men Earl's age who had known him from the years when every farm in Bremer County knew every other farm, and the county fair was where you learned what your neighbors were made of. Diana Caldwell drove up from Des Moines the morning of the service. She had cleared her calendar for the entire day without explanation to her assistant, which was unusual enough that the assistant had noted it. She sat in the back of the church. She had not called Cole to say she was coming. She had not wanted the arrival to be an event. She was there because she owed a debt that could not be invoiced and could not be settled and could only be acknowledged repeatedly in small ways for as long as there was opportunity to acknowledge it. She listened to the service. The pastor spoke about Earl's faithfulness and his steadiness and the particular quality of his presence in the community, which the pastor described as the quality of a man who could always be counted on to do what needed doing without requiring recognition for it. Diana thought that was accurate. She thought it was also insufficient, the way most descriptions of remarkable people are insufficient because remarkable people contain more than language can hold. Afterward, in the parking lot, she found Cole. He had his father's build and his grandfather's eyes, the same quality of attention in them, the same habit of looking at things directly and without pretense. He was 32 now, broader than he had been when Diana had last seen him, with the physical presence of a man who has spent 2 years doing hard outdoor work. He looked like someone who had found the right life. He recognized her. They had met twice before briefly at the farm. He extended his hand. Diana shook it and then held it for a moment, the way you hold a handshake when what you are actually doing is making sure the person knows you are fully present for what comes next. Your grandfather saved my career, she said. The company, the project, and my reputation. All of it was in that hole with the machine. He pulled all of it out. Cole nodded. He knew the story, all of it, from every angle. He would have said he just did what needed doing, Cole said. I know, Diana said. That's what he told me. She reached into her jacket and took out an envelope. Cole looked at it. He did not take it immediately. This isn't from me personally, Diana said. It's from Meridian. After your grandfather helped us, we established a fund, an emergency assistance fund for recovery situations where conventional solutions fail, situations where we need the kind of knowledge that doesn't show up in any engineering manual. She paused. We named it the Whitmore Fund. Cole was still looking at the envelope. He never mentioned it, Cole said. He didn't know, Diana said. A pause. I don't understand, Cole said. Why didn't you tell him? Diana looked at him steadily. Because he would have told me to name it something else, she said. He would have said he hadn't done anything worth naming a fund after that he had just done what needed doing, that the fund should be named after the kind of work, not the person who did it once. She paused again. He would have been wrong about that, so I didn't give him the opportunity to be wrong about it. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that Diana recognized from the faces of people who have just received information that reorganizes something they thought they understood. How long has it existed, he said. Since 2021, Diana said. Cole understood the math. 2 years before his grandfather died. 2 years of a fund carrying Earl Whitmore's name deployed in situations across the Midwest where conventional engineering had run out of answers and older knowledge had been needed. And Earl had gone to sleep and woken up and driven his Caterpillar around his property and taught his grandson how to grease the track rollers and never known any of it. He would have hated that, Cole said, not with bitterness, with the precision of someone who knew exactly who his grandfather had been. Yes, Diana said, he would have. Cole took the envelope. Inside was a check for $50,000 made out to Cole Whitmore personally as the primary beneficiary the fund had designated for the Whitmore family. There was also a letter on Meridian letterhead informing him that the company was simultaneously making a donation of an equal amount to the Bremer County Historical Society's Farm Equipment Preservation Program in Earl Whitmore's name to be used specifically for the restoration and maintenance of pre-1950 crawler tractors in the county's collection. Cole read the letter standing in the church parking lot in December, with the bare trees around him and the cold Iowa sky above him, and Diana stood quietly and let him read it. When he folded it and put it back in the envelope, he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, he would have told you to give it to someone who needed it more. I know, Diana said. That's why there are 2 checks, one for you, one for the machines. Cole looked at her. He would have approved of the second one, he said. Yes, Diana said. I thought he might. The 1935 Caterpillar Diesel 75 is still on the Whitmore farm in Bremer County, Iowa. Cole runs it now. He keeps it on the same schedule. Earl kept the schedule Walter had developed through years of trial and attention. On the same land oil every 50 hours, grease every day. The machine is in use, valve clearances checked every 500 hours. He does the work himself by hand with the same tools Earl had used, some of which Walter had bought new. The machine has not had a major repair in its 89 years of operation. It does not appear to require one. Every spring, Cole starts it up and drives it the full perimeter of the property. Not because the perimeter needs to be driven, because the machine needs to run, and because running it is the act by which he confirms to himself and to it that the relationship between them is still intact, that he is still paying attention, that he has not let the routine slip into carelessness, which is where deterioration always begins, in the small, unnoticed deferrals that accumulate until the thing you were supposed to maintain becomes the thing you have to explain. His children ride with him, sometimes the oldest one sitting on his lap, with her hands on the steering clutch levers, learning the feel of the machine, the way Earl had taught Cole to learn it through touch, through repetition, through the slow accumulation of hours spent in the company of something that rewards attention and punishes neglect. Every October, on the anniversary of the day the drill came out of the ground, Cole drives the Caterpillar down the county road to the place where you can see the Cedar River bend through the bottomland, the same bend where the drill had been boring when the ground gave way. He sits there for a while with the engine idling, looking out at the river and the field and the sky above it, which in October in Iowa is a particular shade of blue that does not exist in any other month, in any other place he has ever been. He does not stay long. There is always work to do. The plaque from Meridian Infrastructure Partners is still in the barn, bolted to the wall above the Caterpillar's left track. The brass has darkened with the years and the barn atmosphere, but the lettering is still clear, presented to Earl Whitmore in recognition of extraordinary assistance to Meridian Infrastructure. Partners, Bremer County, Iowa, October 2019. Some machines don't know when to quit. Neither do some men. Below it, Cole added a smaller plate the winter after Earl died. He cut it from a sheet of brass he ordered from a supplier in Waterloo and stamped the letters himself using a letter stamp set he found in Walter's old toolbox. The letters are not perfectly uniform. Some of them press deeper than others. It looks like something a person made by hand, which is what it is. It reads, "A machine doesn't know how old it is. It only knows if you take care of it." Diana Caldwell came to the farm once after the funeral in the fall of 2024 on a Saturday when the weather was clear and the fields had been harvested and the land had the open, honest quality it gets after the crop is gone and before the snow comes. Cole showed her the barn and the machine and the plaques, and she stood in front of them for a while without speaking. Then she put her hand on the Caterpillar's iron flank. The metal was cold. The machine was exactly what it had always been: dense and deliberate and absolutely indifferent to the passage of time, indifferent in the way that things are indifferent when they have been built for permanence and cared for as though permanence matters. She thought about the August 14th memo in the folder in her truck 5 years ago. She thought about the folder she had carried into every subsequent project, the habit she had built of documenting her reasoning and writing before decisions were made rather than after, the small institutional change that had grown from that one morning in a muddy field beside the Cedar River. She thought about the Whitmore Fund, which had been deployed 11 times in 4 years in situations from Minnesota to Kansas, where the conventional solutions had failed and someone with older knowledge had been asked carefully and respectfully what they thought. She thought about Earl standing at the edge of the hole reading it. She did not say any of this out loud. Cole was standing a few feet away, letting her have the moment which told her something about who he had become in his grandfather's company. There are things that do not need to be spoken to be complete. There are debts that cannot be settled, only honored in the ongoing way of things that have no final accounting. Diana Caldwell was a woman who understood transactions and contracts in the formal language of institutional obligation, and she also understood now the other kind of obligation, the one that has no invoice and no settlement date, the one that you carry forward simply by doing the work correctly, by writing the honest report, by listening to the person who knows, by remembering every time you stand at the edge of a problem that no one else can solve, that somewhere there is someone who has been paying attention to the right things for a very long time, and that the most important skill you can bring to that moment is the willingness to ask. She took her hand off the iron flank of the Caterpillar. She turned to Cole. "How long will it run?" she said. Cole considered the question with the same deliberateness she remembered from his grandfather. "Long as someone takes care of it," he said. Diana nodded. That was the right answer. It had always been the right answer.